to Evangelical Focus. My name is Joel Forster, and today we are speaking to Israel Olofinjana about the development of Christianity in Africa, but also its impact in Europe through the diaspora churches. Israel leads the One People Commission of the United Kingdom Evangelical Alliance. Welcome, Israel.
Thank you very much, Joel. Such a pleasure to be here to have this conversation about African Christianity on the continent and in the diaspora.
Yes, it's super, and it's a very interesting topic that has been more and more in the conversation in Europe as well. So we want to first ask you the question, how are the concepts of religion and more specifically religious freedom understood in Africa, and how is this understanding of religion in Africa different from the understanding that we have in European societies?
I think the concept of religion in Africa is very much different from European Western societies, and mainly because I think African worldview is religious. Religion permeates everything that we do, from even before birth to after death. So religion shapes everything. So Africa has a religious worldview in that sense. And I think when you compare that to a European Enlightenment worldview, you can begin to see the contrast. Europe, of course, used to adopt a religious worldview in the pre-modern societies, in that sense. But of course, with a lot of shifts in culture, Europe embraced modernity. And a key part of that is the Enlightenment thinking, which simply means that God was deposed and reason, how we think, was imposed as it is. And that Enlightenment sort of paradigm, I'm pleased to say, didn't affect Africa directly. It affected us indirectly through colonialism, mission, and other avenues, but didn't affect us directly, which simply means that religious worldview in Africa is still very much intact. Now, when we talk about religious worldview, we'll be talking of not just Christianity, we'll be talking of African traditional religions, of which there are various strands and types of them in different geographic location in Africa. But there's also Islam, and there are other religions as well. But those are the three principal religions you will talk about in the context of Africa. So African worldview is deeply religious. As one African philosopher noted, that Africans are notoriously religious in everything that we do. Before people get on the public transport, they pray. When they get off, they pray. It just shapes everything about you. The kind of job you do, where you live, those kind of things. People ask, consult, the spiritual around those kind of issues. So that's how religion is viewed, and how it's very different from the European context. In terms of religious worldview, again, it's very different because I think tension arises from a particular key question, and that is, depending on how Christianity is viewed. If Christianity is viewed as a foreign religion, if it is viewed as an imposition, as a white man's religion, then it is seen as an imposition on African culture and thinking. And so sometimes religious conflicts arise because of that, because either traditional religious people or other religions will see Christianity as a threat, that it's not our way of life, it's not African, it's not seen from there. But then if it is understood from a premise that actually African Christianity is indigenous, going back to the church fathers, then that shifts the conversation. But oftentimes that latter understanding is not prevalent. The one that is prevalent because of particularly how Christianity was planted during some of the missionary endeavors in Africa. Of course, it was successful, it was fruitful, but also it left a lot of problems. And so because of that, most of the time, Christianity is viewed as a threat to an African way of thinking and life. And as a result of that, people see it as a threat to other religions. And so hence conflict or persecution will arise as a result of that in that sense. So in that context, we can talk about religious freedom. We can talk about Christian being persecuted in various spaces in that sense. But again, something that is different is the way I think we approach religious freedom in the West is so premised on individuality, is so premised on individualism. And sometimes I feel in our approach, whereas I think in the context of Africa, people look at these things in terms of community. People look at it in terms of, so for example, if someone is converting, there are implications from where they are converting from and how sometimes that might upset the balance of society and community, in that sense. And there's been mistakes that has been made. Of course, not saying we shouldn't share the gospel, but it just means the understanding and the sensitivity around the religions in Africa and what conversion will actually mean to someone and whether Christians are prepared and ready to embrace that person. I've got so many friends growing up that when they converted from Islam to Christianity, it means being ostracized totally. And, thank God there were Christians families who were ready to take some families on. But there are some instances where that is difficult. And so there is that holistic thinking and approach to some of these issues that I think might be very different from our Western way of looking at this in that sense.
That's very interesting as the context you're giving of all of Africa and the question about identity as well and Christendom and Christianity in the past in Africa. So focusing a bit more on Christianity itself as one of the main religions in Africa. And if you look at Anglican Church, for instance, or the Baptist churches or the big Pentecostal world, how are these denominations, Protestant denominations, different in Africa than in Europe and other Western places?
I think they are very different in Africa because one of the big shifts in African Christianity is Pentecostal and charismatic expression of Christianity, the explosion there's been various Pentecostal revivals in Africa from your 1920s to your 1960s and 70s in different parts. That simply means that Pentecostal charismatic expressions of Christianity is one of the largest and fastest growing in Africa. And looking back, I think one of the influence of that is when you look at other denominations, sometimes people travel to Africa and they went to a Catholic church or Baptist or Anglican, and they're like, it feels very Pentecostal. And that is because of that Pentecostal influence that has come through, because the churches that were growing were your Pentecostal. So there was a massive drift from people leaving the mainline denominations to the Pentecostal churches in that sense. And so it was a case of the other denominations trying to adapt and copy some useful things in that sense and adopt it for their own, to the extent that even Islam in some parts of Africa copies African, Pentecostalism because of that, growth that it has, whether the large gatherings or watch night services or, those kind of Pentecostal distinctives that are being emulated in other forms of Christianity in that sense. So when you go to an average Baptist church, they might be very Pentecostal. Won't be surprised if they even speak in tongues because of, again, of that, familiarity and just trying to replicate something that they see is really growing. So African Christianity is dynamic because of that. Of course, there are still some pitfalls, but nevertheless, Pentecostal charismatic Christianity has really changed the landscape in several ways.
Could you comment a bit on the difference of theology, even understanding of the Bible, understanding of the authority of the Bible between Africa and Europe in some of the denominations?
I think, yes, distinctives in terms of African and Western theology. Oh, there are lots of distinctives. I think African theology is more oral in terms of sometimes there is stories, there's testimonies, there is liturgy. It's looking at African proverbs. It's looking at African, poems to elucidate theological thought. I think Western theology sometimes is too rationalistic, sometimes too abstract. The way we do theology is how loud can you speak through a journal, or can you defend your argument or thesis through a journal, which a lot of African theologians do. But largely African theology is more of a practical theology, in the sense that it is seeking to look at the lived experiences of people and how to speak, to contextualize or to indigenize Christianity among its own people, to make Christianity relevant to the political situation, to the economic situation. And in that sense, I'm not saying Western Christianity or theology doesn't do that. Of course it does, it's contextual. But it's largely abstract in its operations. So there is that. So there is that that we see in how theologizing is being done in that sense. And another big aspect of a difference in African theology is the fact that actually, because when it started, it was highly contextual, trying to really reach out to Africans. I think one could actually argue that African theology and other contextual theologies have influenced Western Christianity in how we contextualize. What does it mean to think of a local context, a geographic context, or a particular area? So there is also that influence that we can begin to trace in theological spaces. And in that sense, that I think it's very, very important. And also another aspect is African theology is a big part of it is trying to wrestle with that realities of the African people. And a major part of that is a post-colonial thinking, trying to decolonize the sort of colonial paradigms in Africa. So as a result of that, is post-colonial. And it's fair to say that many Western forms of theologies are not post-colonial. It's only now we're beginning to catch up with those sort of thinking, but we still have a lot of work to do in the Western context. So African theology is very post-colonial because of that decolonization process that it's trying to do as well.
You mentioned many interesting and positive and hopeful movements in Africa and Christianity, but there are also African intellectuals and even Nobel Prizes who would point to the difficult parts or the challenges or the things that some things that we sometimes see in the media, which might not be the whole picture, but still part of the realities. There is talk about sometimes economic corruption in big churches or big ties with the politicians, with the politics, and also the whole issue that for evangelicals is important of the debate around about prosperity gospel. So how are good Christian leaders in Africa addressing those challenges? What are the responses?
Yes, I think those challenges do exist, because at the end of the day, every form of Christianity will have its own weakness. And I think there are those challenges of abuse of leadership that we sometimes see in African Christianity, the abuse of leadership, which at times manifests itself in hero worship, or the extreme versions of prosperity gospel, which sometimes lends itself to only few people prospering at the expense of the masses. So we see those problems, but these have been addressed through various ways. There are different church movements. And again, this is where we have to be very careful, because I think when we talk about African Christianity, in fact, we should be talking about African Christianities in the plural. or even African theologies in the plural. And the reason is because when we just even think about African theology, are you speaking of the French African theology or the English African theology, the one emanating from Francophone countries or Anglophone countries? So there is that. Are you speaking of the evangelical evangelical African theology or Catholic African theology? So there are those delineations. And when we talk about Christianities, yes, there are some parts that are corrupt or have issues, but that is not the total story in that sense. So I think it's important to talk about that. But there are various ways this is being addressed. And I think just to come back to the prosperity one, because I know that that's really a big one that people do talk about, and one that I think really makes people wonder what's going on there. And I think anyone who has really done a deeper study around prosperity gospel will understand that there are actually different versions of prosperity gospel. The one that is popular is the one that is like, yeah, people prospering at the expense of the masses, or feels like a kind of paying penance or indulgence that goes back to the Middle Ages, where you pay something so that God can do you a favor or something like that. But I think those are the extreme versions. There are other versions of prosperity gospel that lends itself to thinking around God is going to prosper you so that you can be a channel of blessing to your community. Almost a kind of a, if I may use the term, commonwealth prosperity, in a sense that you're thinking of the common good of people in your community. And I think there is a version of that prosperity that do exist in Africa. And one of the ways that manifests itself is people helping that community, either in terms of economic development, sometimes in terms of even of climate justice issues, speaking into that, advocating in that sense, or tackling some of the poverty issues in Africa. And there are people who are into prosperity who are engaging such issues, but they are not known, or they are not widely publicized in that sense. So there are those other aspects of that that I think it's addressing various issues in Africa.
That's really interesting. Thank you for this wider picture of understanding the difference, the diversity in the different theologies. Speaking of Europe now, so there is this vitality of the African church, and has been migration not only now but for many decades, and there's a long past of Africans in Europe, but now we are more and more aware of these churches started in different cities in Europe by African leaders, Christian leaders, African denominations, African ministries, African migrants. So where do we see mostly these churches in Europe?
I think, yeah, there's a lot of African churches across Europe, African Christians. I think UK seems to be perhaps a place where there's that concentration, maybe because of the geography and the history, the connection of British history with African history. So I would say there is a serious growth of African Christianity in Britain, which goes way back. I mean, some of the African churches in the UK, they go back to the 18th century in that sense. So there is just a proliferation of them over time in that sense. But there are other countries in Europe as well. It's not just only UK, Netherlands, Germany. Germany also has a lot of African churches. Sweden has a lot of African churches, Spain as well, and Italy. These are other countries that also have high concentration of African churches in that sense. But I think UK, because of that geography and that history, has so many of them. And again, African Christianity in Europe is not homogeneous. And again, we must be very careful to tease that out, because there are different kinds of African churches. There are African indigenous churches, or AICs. There are African Pentecostals. There are African churches within your European mainline denominations, whether you look at Germany or you look at Sweden or you look at Italy. So you have these various expressions of African Christianity all over Europe in that sense, that are planting churches and extending. In fact, some of the largest churches in Europe are led by Africans. Whether you look at different aspects of whether you look at UK or you look at even Ukraine. Before the war, there was a massive church in Ukraine led by a Nigerian. So you have these churches led by different Africans dotted all over that are growing. Of course, they have their challenges in that sense, but nevertheless, they are scattered all over and growing.
And you mentioned Nigeria. I guess Nigeria would be one of the main countries sending missionaries to Europe. What other countries would you say that are having an influence in Europe in sending missions and ministries and planting churches?
Yes, Ghanaians as well. There are lots of Ghanaian missionaries and Christians across Europe as well. So Ghanaians, also Zimbabweans, and also Zambians, Kenyans. These are African countries that are sending. Or I suppose the way mission is taking place is some are intentionally being sent. Some have come as refugees, asylum seekers, or what we might call economic migrant, but nevertheless engaging in God's mission in the European space. So there's a mixture of the picture that we see from people being sent intentionally to people coming as with other factors, but engaging in mission on the back of that in that sense. So that today, an average missionary could be a refugee from Ethiopia. An average missionary could be an economic migrant from Cameroon in the European space. So, those are the way Africans are changing our understanding of who is a missionary into 21st century. And also, I think the fact that we have the presence of African Christians, missionaries, and churches also it recognizes the fact that Europe is also a mission field. Whereas when we talk about in mission thinking before, Europe was never conceived as a mission field. It was never thought that Europe was going to be a mission field. It was always the emphasis on we need to go to Africa, we need to go to Latin America, we need to go to Asia. But now we have many missionaries who have come because of that sense of calling that actually Europe is a mission field. And I think that understanding is shaping how mission is taking place today.
So one last question related with what you were just saying. Europe is a mission field, and many Africans have this missionary mindset when you arrive to Europe. So what is the encouragement, the positivism, the mission vision that Africans can offer to European Christians who are kind of disencouraged about secularism and the fact that we are in a post-Christian continent? What are Africans helping Europeans to understand and to do in God's mission?
So I think there are several layers to that question. I think that in itself poses some challenges to African mission, but at the same time also gives us a window of opportunity. So it's a mixed bag. One is European missions in Africa were coming from a supposed civilized superior culture into an inferior one. Now, the secular agenda in Europe simply means that people see religion as no longer relevant. Although we talk about post-secular, which is saying how religion and the secular worldviews coexist, but there is still the understanding of liberal democracy and our fundamental human rights that says that, okay, religion is just something that is confined to a private space, not the public in that sense. So that simply means for an average missionary coming from Africa, their mission has a double barriers to overcome. One is coming from a supposed inferior culture into a first world, from a developing or so-called developing into the developing space. And so there is that challenge of mitigating and understanding that secular thinking before you can even begin to engage in mission. So the first barrier is that secular worldview. And then the second is actually how you now begin to penetrate Europe with the gospel. So it poses a challenge because of that. But then on the other hand, the opportunity that gives us is, I believe strongly that sometimes as European Christians, because we grew up in this culture, there is a way that the solutions we prefer, of course, why it's contextual and because it understands the culture. But there are times you need an outsider to help you elucidate the problem and to help you to prefer a better and a holistic solution as you think together. So I think those of us who are coming from outside, because we have not been shaped by that Enlightenment thinking, because we are coming with that religious worldview, there is something about a faith that is robust, that believe that God can do the impossible. And I think that sense of optimism, that faith in God that can change things, is one that I think the African Christians have really brought in, which is not surprised that they are the ones growing the fastest and the largest churches, because of that raw faith in God, because of their passion, because of their belief that miracles can still happen today. They've not been tainted by a rationalistic worldview that reduces our world just to the natural. They still believe in the supernatural. So, or they believe in healing, or they believe that God can do this or that. And so that infuses optimism, that challenges the secular worldview, that is not the only story we have to tell. That is not the only narrative. Yes, there is the natural, but what about the supernatural? How do we consider that in that sense? So they are simply putting back religion on the table, and they are simply saying that God does exist. If the European worldview is saying God is dead or God doesn't exist, Africans are saying actually it does. I'm an example that it does exist. Here's my story. Here's my testimony. What do you think about that? And so those kind of stories challenges our secular worldview. And I think if we work in partnership, we can help to develop and contextualize the gospel for the European space. After all, Europe is no longer monocultural. Europe itself has changed, is very multicultural now. So we need all the divine wisdom of God, as Paul puts it in Ephesians, the multifaceted wisdom of God that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 3, the manifold wisdom of God, as he calls it. We need it today in the European context.
Israel Olofinjana, thank you very much. And we just in perhaps 1 minute, what is the One People Commission of the EA UK, and what is your mission there?
The One People Commission of the UK is a network initiative that brings together different church leaders from the Black majority church constituency, South Asian constituency, Chinese churches, Latin American, and South Korean churches. And it existed with sort of three purposes. One is to model the fact that God's people are one people, speaking with one voice and engaging in one mission, God's mission. But today, our emphasis is on three words, and that is intercultural church unity, intercultural churches, and intercultural justice, which simply put is about unity, is about integration, and it's about justice. And that is what we are seeking to do in today's context.
Thank you very much, Israel. Thank you for your insights, for helping us understand better African Christianity, but also its impact, its good impact in Europe.
Thank you very much. God bless.